Welcome. This tour will trace some of the landmarks of the 1967 uprising that shook the city of Detroit in the summer of 1967. The tour uses software that allows us to join text, still and video images, and sound with Google Earth images, enabling visitors to immerse themselves in those chaotic days. Using free software and limited only by the expertise and imagination of the tour creators, this could be a cost-effective addition to the educational materials offered by the Detroit 67 project. Before we begin, it is important to keep in mind that Detroit was a deeply segregated city. Black Detroiters were restricted in where they could live, work, and play, and were regularly denied the same economic opportunities afforded their white counterparts. In the years prior to the uprising, historically Black neighborhoods had been razed for the construction of freeways and housing projects, and so the neighborhoods that Black Detroiters could live in had become increasingly crowded and tense. Our story begins on a hot summer night in just such a neighborhood, Virginia Park. The conflict began when Detroit police raided an after-hours bar or Blind Pig housed in the Economy Printing Building at 12th and Claremont on July 23rd. The bar was hosting a party for two Black veterans returning from Vietnam and another soldier departing for service in the war. The raid was reported to have been particularly violent, and as close to 80 people were arrested and taken outside into police wagons, a crowd began to gather. The crowd grew outraged as they witnessed the officers using nightsticks, gun butts, and their fists on the men and women they arrested. Unfortunately, this was nothing new, as Black Detroiters had endured decades of racism and brutality at the hands of an entirely white Detroit police force. A young Black man is reported to have said, "Why do they come down here and do this to our neighborhood? If this happened in Grosse Pointe, they wouldn't be acting this way." A bottle was thrown, shattering the windshield of a police car. Tensions continued to escalate as the crowds grew larger, and a little after 5 a.m., the rebellion had begun. By its end, smoldering piles of debris had replaced a bustling neighborhood of apartments, houses, bars, and shops. After years of neighborhood surveillance, it was the officers of the 10th Precinct who raided the Blind Pig and arrested the owners and patrons. The tensions that grew during the raid were compounded by the long wait time for vehicles to arrive at the bar to take the arrestees in for booking. During the riots, the 10th Precinct, as the closest precinct to 12th and Claremont, became the de facto headquarters for law enforcement and civic leaders who were working together to end the violence. After the riots, hundreds of complaints were filed against Detroit police officers, of which 110 were referred to the Justice Department. Residents claimed that police were performing illegal searches, holding men and women in the same cells when there were open cells available, and breaking into residents' homes and threatening the occupants. Complaints were leveled against guardsmen as well, including one from 5 people who had witnessed the bayoneting of 2 Black Detroiters. Though nothing remains, this is the site of what was once the Algiers Motel. Here, on July 26, 1967, Detroit police killed 3 Black teenagers, Aubrey Pollard, Carl Cooper, and Fred Temple. Officers claimed that a gun battle had occurred, though no weapons were ever found, and witnesses said that the young men were deliberately murdered by the police. Aubrey Pollard, 19, Carl Cooper, 17, and Fred Temple, 18, were in a room at the Algiers with 2 young white women. They were playing games and listening to music when police and guardsmen stormed the hotel in search of snipers. The 3 young men were shot, and the white girls were beaten. No weapons were found at the scene. Patrolman Ronald August was officially charged with Pollard's death, and Patrolman Robert Pye was charged with Temple's murder, but was eventually acquitted due to lack of evidence. The police report lists Cooper's killers as unknown. In 1969, famed African American poet Michael Harper read a poem he wrote about the incident at an event in San Francisco State University. The poem was called A Mother Speaks, the Algiers Motel Incident, Detroit.
It's too dark to see black in the windows of Woodward or Virginia Park. The undertaker pushes his body black into place with plastic and gum, but it wouldn't hold water. When I looked for marks or liniment or fine stitching, I was led away without seeing this plastic face they built that was not my son's. They tied the eye torn out by shotgun into place and his shattered arm cut away with his buttocks that remained. My son's gone by white hands, though he said to his last word, "Oh, I'm so sorry, officer. I broke your gun."
Our next stop is the Herman Kiefer Health Complex. Embattled police and firefighters established a command center in the Herman Kiefer Hospital, located a few blocks away from where the rebellion started. Though centrally located, the use of the facility was not without its problems. Hospital staff, patients, law enforcement, and firefighters had to contend with sniper fire from surrounding buildings. There are even accounts of National Guardsmen helping lost children who were under sniper fire. Second, the hospital itself was known for treating infectious disease for the poorest of the community. So there was a possibility that if violence occurred at the hospital, it might spread infectious disease into the community. Despite these challenges, the hospital still operated while it also served law enforcement and firefighters, though it was nearly impossible to get patients in or out. In fact, some of the staff did not leave the hospital at all for the duration of the rebellion. The mayor of the city of Detroit in the summer of 1967 was Jerome Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh, a Democrat, was relatively young when he took office and was quite popular. In fact, he showed promise as a future Democratic candidate on a national level. All that changed, however, in the summer of 1967. Kavanaugh was not seen to have taken decisive action to curb the violence in the streets of Detroit. Decades of systemic oppression by the Detroit police force made them less effective in dealing with Black Detroiters. In addition, the force was simply not large or well trained enough to quickly bring this violence under control. Recognizing that early attempts to end the uprising were failing, Mayor Kavanaugh sent a request for assistance to Governor George Romney, who declared a state of emergency on July 23rd and sent in the State National Guard to assist local law enforcement. Around 11 a.m. on July 24th, Romney formally asked President Lyndon B. Johnson to dispatch troops to Michigan. That afternoon, approximately 5,000 troops were airlifted to Selfridge Air Force Base and were deployed that night. After the uprising, Mayor Kavanaugh acted to try to address the systemic injustice that underpinned the violence in Detroit. He co-founded New Detroit and worked to help start the city in a new direction. It was not enough to salvage his political career, however, and Kavanaugh's hopes of holding state or federal office were never realized before his untimely death at age 51. Our last stop is the Detroit Historical Museum. The Detroit Historical Museum forms one corner of the Midtown Detroit Cultural Complex, including the Detroit Institute of Arts, Detroit Public Library, and educational institutions Wayne State University and the Center for Creative Studies. The museum, along with the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, is administered by the Detroit Historical Society, whose mission is to tell Detroit's stories and why they matter. The museum houses exhibits that document the cultural, political, and industrial growth of the city, from a Native American settlement to its founding as a European outpost in 1701, all the way through to the present day. Anticipating the 50th anniversary of the 1967 uprising, The museum began to document the event through the collection of artifacts and hundreds of oral histories from people of all walks of life who witnessed those days firsthand. The goals of this collection are far more ambitious than just to set up an archive or exhibit, however. The Detroit Historical Society has made it a priority to share these compelling records, to actively challenge long held perceptions and spark new dialogue and new ideas. Using social media, teaching materials for diverse ages, discussion groups, and special events, the Detroit 67 Project has embraced the future of museums as not just repositories of history, but active participants in civic life. This, then, is a fitting place to end our tour, and we encourage you to visit www.detroit1967.org for more to explore.